One of the major stumbling block for any beginner photographer is how to set his DSLR or mirrorless in manual mode. I have created a series of videos which will help you understand the science behind how to set your camera in manual mode. Hi, my name is Amol Patil and I'm the founder of Masterpics, a leading photography agency operating out of Mumbai. I am also a photography educator who has taught more than 5,000 students in the art and science of photography. As part of the video series, how to set your camera in manual mode, let's get cracking on the most important topic, which is exposure triangle. So what is exposure triangle? As you know, the triangle has three sides and the exposure triangle parameters are shutter, aperture and ISO. These three parameters must balance each other to give you the correct exposure. Don't worry, don't get too intimidated by the illustration. I am going to exactly decipher each and every parameter for your benefit. So let's get cracking with the first parameter of the exposure triangle, which is aperture. Aperture is the opening in the lens that permits light to get inside the camera. Just like we human beings have eyes and the eyes have iris in it, which controls the amount of light getting in a camera, similarly, the iris of the lens is called aperture. Aperture open, aperture close. The opening and closing of the aperture has two impacts on the picture that you click. Firstly, the amount of light getting in the camera either increases or decreases with the opening and closing of the lens aperture. Secondly, it has a bearing on the depth of field. Depth of field is nothing but how blur the background is compared to the subject. Okay, so let's try and see what aperture does to light. So as you can see, as the aperture diameter increases from left to right, the brightness increases. And on the other hand, when you start decreasing the aperture diameter, what happens? The picture becomes dark because what you're doing, you're closing the window. The depth of field depends on how big or small the aperture is. Just remember, when the aperture diameter is small, okay, you will get high depth of field. Can you see? Corresponding to this small aperture diameter, you are getting high depth of field. What do you mean by high depth of field? Not only the subject is in focus, but also the background is in focus, sharp and clear. Okay, so you can see the subject, the trees behind the subject, the bench, and even the clouds in the sky because high depth of field. As you start increasing the diameter of the aperture from left to right, see what is happening to the depth of field from left to right. High depth of field is slowly and gradually converting to shallow depth of field. What do you mean by shallow depth of field? The background starts becoming blurry, creamy, soft, silky, right? Isn't it what photographers want? So that is the effect that you start getting once you start increasing the aperture diameter. So when the aperture diameter is at the maximum, as in this case, only the subject is in focus, whereas everything behind falls under shallow depth of field. You are not able to make out what's behind the subject. The trees, the clouds, okay, the people, they are all disappeared because it has become blurry. Okay, shallow depth of field. Just to summarize, bigger the aperture diameter, more is the light, shallow is the depth of field. On the other hand, smaller the aperture diameter, less is the light, high is the depth of field. Before we proceed to the demonstration of aperture, let me just tell you about the f number. Can you see these numbers? f8, f5.6, f2.8. Okay, these fractions, they are nothing but f numbers. You can consider them as unit of measurement of aperture. Okay, don't worry, I mean, you need not memorize these fractions. It will come naturally to you as you practice photography. Just remember, smaller the f number, bigger is the aperture diameter. Bigger the f number, smaller is the aperture. Inverse relationship. Just remember this. So as you can see, which is the smallest f number here? f2.8. And the corresponding aperture diameter is the biggest. Whereas the biggest f number is f8, whereas the aperture diameter for f8 is the smallest. So let's jump into our live view and let's see how the light and depth of field varies with aperture diameter. So ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, let me just brief you on the setup here. So you can see my DSLR is mounted on a tripod. It is connected to my laptop through the cable. We have a model here. Can you say hi to Natalia? She is going to help us out with all the demonstrations. And as you can see, Natalia is currently in New York. As you see, Statue of Liberty behind her. Fine? Great. So let's get into the live view. And here we are. Right, as you can see, all the controls of my camera, right, all the controls of my camera are on the left hand side panel. Shutter, aperture, ISO, white balance, exposure, focus modes, everything is there. Great. So let's focus on the aperture part of it. So I'll be changing the aperture from big to small, small to big, and we will see how it impacts light and the depth of field. Fine. So first let me set the aperture to a small aperture diameter, which means bigger f number, f16. Okay, so how do you know that the light has decreased? Can you see this? This plus minus graduated scale, it's called the light meter. It's showing negative. Right? It means that your camera is getting less light. Therefore, it is showing negative. Fine. So just to take care of it, let me balance it out. Right. So I have balanced it to 0. Why 0? Don't worry. When you go to the light meter video, you will get to see the greater details of it. But as of now, just focus on the aperture part. Autofocus and capture. Right, photo is transferring and here we are. Okay, f16. So smaller the aperture, higher is the depth of field, and therefore you are not only able to see the subject Natalia who is in focus, but also the background, the Statue of Liberty is also pretty sharp and in focus. Right, that's because small aperture, big f number. Back to the live mode, and this time I am going to increase the aperture diameter, and we'll see how it impacts light and, for that matter, depth of field. So from f16 I am going to change to f1.8, which is the smallest f number available on my lens. f1.8. Boom. Can you see? Can you see the difference? It has made the background completely blur. That's because big aperture diameter. Now let's see what has happened to the light. The light meter is showing positive. So let me balance it out. How do I balance it out? Don't worry. You can refer to the light meter video, which will tell you exactly how the light meter functions. Otherwise, just be patient and let me set. Yes, great. Autofocus and capture. Remember, aperture is f1.8. Photo is transferring and here we are. Okay, Can you see this? f1.8. At f1.8, what has happened? Subject is in focus, background is blur. Whereas at f16, both subject and the background are pretty much in focus. Let's compare it side by side. Okay, the picture on the left hand side is clicked at f16, which is a big F number, which translates to a small aperture. Small aperture means high depth of field. Okay, the picture on the right hand side is clicked at f1.8. So smaller the F number, bigger is the aperture diameter. Bigger the aperture diameter, shallow is the depth of field. So ladies and gentlemen, this is how aperture impacts the light entering into your camera, as a consequence of which your picture becomes either bright or dark. And similarly, it also has an impact on depth of field, as we just saw. Request you to follow the entire series for clarity on manual mode. See you in the next video. Till then, happy clicking.